Okay, I pressed the record button and it shows me that I'm recording now. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I wanted to take the time to welcome you to the second virtual Q&A webinar hosted by the Community Services Division, Tribal Justice Department at AVCP. Thank you for thank you for joining us in this virtual space. My name is Denise Nerby. I serve as the Community Services Division Training Manager, and I apologize. I know you can't see me on the video. My internet will glitch out if I show my face. So um, I just wanted to welcome you into this virtual training session and let you know a little bit about myself. I was born and raised here in Bethel. My parents are Barbara and Carl Anvil Sr. I'm married with 3 children, ages 13, 11, and 4. Today, we will spend time talking about cultural adoptions, best practices, and the Bureau of Vital Statistics, which is now called the Department of Health and Social Services, Health Analytics, and Vital Records. At this time, I wanted to go over some housekeeping items. This training is being recorded for future viewing and will be available on the AVCP YouTube channel. After the presentation, there will be a question and answer session where we invite everyone to unmute yourself and ask whatever question you might have. Since we're in a virtual environment, to start off, everyone is muted. Online, there is a microphone button at the top right hand of your screen to mute and unmute yourself, or if you're calling in by phone, you could unmute yourself or remute yourself by pressing *6. I'd also like to ask that everyone please keep your phones or computer microphones muted at all times unless speaking. There's an available chat feature for participants joining through the online app that will be monitored for questions and asked during each Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Everyone should have received an email with the presentation material for this event, which includes the slide deck and a State of Alaska cultural adoption packet. This would have gone to the email address that you registered with. If you've not received that, please let us know by emailing dthompson@avcp.org. I'll drop it in the chat, but also that's dthompson@avcp.org. If you were here for the last virtual event, you will remember our presenter, Rick Garcia, who is the co-director of Law and Policy for the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. I'm going to go ahead and hand the time to you, Rick.
Awesome. Thank you, Denise. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today for the second installment of this training. And I'm going to try to share my screen now. Can everybody see my screen?
I can see it, Rick.
Perfect. Well, as Denise mentioned, my name is Rick Garcia. My Yupik name that was gifted to me by Albin Jimmy is Ngakak. My mom is from South Korea, and my dad is from Mexico. I'm originally from Miami, Florida, and I came to Alaska in 2018. And when I came to Alaska, I began working with AVCP alongside with Denise and Ubai and all the great people at AVCP as the Associate General Counsel first, and then the Tribal Justice Director. And I will say that I had some of the best times I've had in Alaska working and living in Bethel, and really appreciate my time there, and always so eager to come back and help out the AVCP tribes and Denise and her program. When I left AVCP, I moved to Antioch, and I served as a district court magistrate judge for the Alaska court systems. And I was based in Antioch and also Hooper Bay, and then finally moved to Anchorage and now work for the Resource Center, where I focus my efforts, again, on really helping tribes, tribal justice systems, and tribal courts build capacity to handle those issues that are most sensitive and needed by the community at the community level, so that we're not running to our state courts for assistance. And so I'm really glad to be back in the tribal realm. I feel like working with tribes and the work that I do with tribes here in Alaska is super important, and it is always so fulfilling. And so I'm really glad to be here today. I wanted to share just a little bit about the Resource Center and what we do, and then move on to our presentation today about cultural adoptions. But the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center was first organized in 2015. And since that time, we've been really dedicated to strengthening local tribal government responses through lots of community organizing efforts. that really advocate for the safety of women and children in their communities and homes, especially against all of the various forms of violence. So domestic violence, gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, sexual abuse and violence. And how we do that is we work with local tribal governments, again, tribal nonprofits, and our organizational partners to develop those local responses based on local voices, languages, and teachings. And so the work that we do with tribes and tribal organizations, it's collaborative and it's really guided by what your community needs or what the tribal community needs and what the needs of the community are. And we try to make sure that we're meeting tribes and organizations where they're at and providing them that technical assistance, that training, and that support to help them elevate their victim services programming. And also that we're looking at their tribal justice systems, their courts, their public safety systems as a whole, as a way of combating domestic violence and all of the different various forms of violence that happened in our villages. And our mission, which guides our work each day, is that our tribal women, our tribal communities, and families will become free from violence by utilizing effective, community-based, and culturally impactful responses to domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, trafficking, and sexual assault. And so we do that through a number of different initiatives. And when I'm sharing about what the Resource Center does, I like to share that we have really three main different departments that provide services and support to tribes and tribal organizations. The first is our training and technical assistant teams, and they are led by experts in the field who have been performing and doing survivor services types of services at tribes for many, many years. And that team provides training and technical assistance on tribal programs and services that support victims. Our law and policy team, which is myself and Kendra Kloster, we do a lot of training and technical assistance to tribal courts, to tribal justice systems, to really improve infrastructure, to improve service delivery, and justice-related services to tribal citizens. And then we also have a grants department where our grants team can help tribes and tribal organizations that have different federal grants manage grants from the beginning, from inception, all the way through to closeout. And so that looks like PMT reporting, end of cycle reporting, helping to create new narratives and budgets. So we really pride ourselves at the resource setting on having a really robust team that can handle all aspects of what tribes needs when they're considering their victim services and when they're considering their tribal courts and tribal justice services. And of course, the work that we do is not alone. We rely heavily on partnerships throughout Alaska and throughout the United States. And some of the tribal partners that we work with include the Monarch Women's Shelter, the Yupik Women's Coalition, Healing Native Hearts Coalition, University of Alaska Fairbanks. And then our national partners include the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, the Indian Law Resource Center, NCAI, the Pohana o na Hawahine, which is the Hawaiian shelter, and then also state organizations such as ANSVA and the Council on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. So that's a little bit about us. Back to the topic today, we're going to be talking about cultural adoptions in Alaska. And so I always like to start out with a presentation roadmap, or what I hope the presentation is going to cover today. So today we're going to start by talking a little bit about adoption terminology and basics. And then we're going to pivot and move on to tribal adoptions, where we're going to talk about due process. And we're going to talk about some important findings that we may want to consider when we're handling a cultural adoption through our tribal council. We're going to talk about the cultural adoption process. We're going to review some of the adoption forms that were shared by you from Denise from the state. We're going to talk about best practices and recommendations. And then we're going to finally close up with some resources, some Q&A, and some final thoughts in closing. I do want to say that, I really want to make sure this presentation is interactive. So if anybody has any questions throughout, please feel free to throw them in the chat or to unmute yourselves and stop me. I tend to get very excited when I'm talking about tribal justice things, but I want to make sure that all of your questions, everyone who's attending today, that they're answered. So please feel free to stop me if you have any questions. So I wanted to first start off by talking about some adoption terminology and basics. And a lot of these terms, everyone's going to know. We're all very familiar with adoption terminology and what things are called. But I wanted to kind of highlight certain topics because of how they're utilized in the state cultural adoption forms, and also because some terminologies that we use or some terms that we use, they have legal implications because they're based on federal law. So I wanted to kind of start off with the basics. And of course, the first term we're going to talk about is adoption. And I think that each of us understand what adoption is. But when we're talking about it from a legal standpoint, it's the act really of taking another person's child legally into your family to raise as your own child. And so you'll see here that adoption, it talks about the social, the emotional, and that legal process in which children who will not be raised by their birth parents become full and permanent legal members of another family, all while maintaining that genetic and that psychological connections to their original birth family. So that is the definition of adoption that we're going to lead today's presentation with. But at its simplest point, it's the act of taking another child into your home legally and raising that child as your own. I also want to highlight the original birth certificate, and this is going to be referred to throughout the presentation. And again, it's called the original birth certificate because that's what the state of Alaska has on their forms. And so I want to make sure that we are mirroring that language throughout the presentation. But the original birth certificate, this is the birth certificate of the child before any formal adoption process. And so it's going to be the child's birth certificate that's issued when they're born. And again, it's the birth certificate that's issued before any formal adoption process. And I think all of us are familiar with that looks like. Generally has a mother's name and a father's name, a place of birth. It has the child's name at birth. But that's what we're going to refer to today as the original birth certificate. Some more terminology, the biological parents. So when we talk about biological parents today, those are going to be the parents who are originally named on the child's original birth certificate. So it's going to be mom and dad's name on the birth certificate the child received at birth. It could have mom's name, it could have dad's name, it could have both names. But that's going to be the one that's issued when the child is born. A substitute birth certificate, and that's a funny name for me, but that is what the state calls it. A substitute birth certificate is going to be the child's birth certificate after they have been adopted. So this is going to be what most of our conversation today is going to be surrounding, is how do we get a birth certificate after a tribal cultural adoption occurs. And the state refers to this as a substitute birth certificate. And this birth certificate is going to reflect the adopted parents' names and the child's adoptive name if it changes after adoption. So this is going to be, again, once an adoption has gone through some type of court process, either through your tribal courts or through your tribal council through a cultural adoption. But the state refers to it as a substitute birth certificate. And so that's what we're going to really refer to it throughout the presentation today. And then Indian child. And this is one of those definitions that has a legal definition under federal law. And you'll see here the cite to that federal citation is 25 United States Code, section 1903, subsection 4. And what it means any unmarried person who is under the age of 18 and is either a member of an Indian tribe or eligible for membership. And so we know that when we think about citizen or we think about Indian childs, we know that there's really two categories of Indian childs for any tribe, right? It's going to be those who are already enrolled or those who are eligible for enrollment. And so the federal law definition for Indian child, which really guides the entire cultural process, adoption process here in Alaska, requires, again, unmarried, under 18, and either a member or eligible for membership. And then you'll see my note at the bottom there that tribal membership and the criteria for tribal membership is really determined by the tribe. And so that's going to be, it's codified in federal law. But I also want to mention that so when we're looking at who is eligible for membership in your tribe, we want to make sure that we're referring back to your existing tribal laws, your existing tribal constitution, because that should determine and it should tell you who is eligible for membership in your particular tribe. And then finally, parent A and parent B. And these are some terms that are found on the state of Alaska forms. And this is in case we have same-sex couples who are adopting, and we don't have one, we're not going to have a mother or father or father. They denote that as parent A and parent B. When we're going through the forms later on, if you have a same-sex couple who's adopting through the cultural adoption process, and you select this option, the birth certificate is going to show as parent and parent instead of mother and father. And again, that would be the substitute birth certificate. That's going to be the second birth certificate after some type of formal adoption process through the court system. But this is utilized for same-sex couples. Okay, so talking about tribal adoptions, due process, and important findings. This next section is really going to go through and we're going to talk about the different types of tribal adoptions in Alaska. And then we're going to focus our efforts really on cultural adoptions because that is what we're going to be talking about today. And then we'll move on into the state of Alaska forms and start talking about what they look information is required. But we've already talked about adoptions today, but we're going to go back to them just a little bit because there are really different ways that a tribe can do an adoption in Alaska. So the adoption of a minor tribal citizen, again, either those already enrolled or those eligible for enrollment, can be completed really through two processes in Alaska. So Alaska tribes utilize really one of two avenues to conduct tribal adoptions. And I want to just pause and say that what we're talking about today is when the tribe handles their own adoptions. This is outside of state court. So state court is not going to be involved in anything we're talking about today. This is strictly when an adoption is happening through a tribe, either through the tribal courts or tribal justice systems or through the tribal council. And so the first process, and let me back up, what process that a tribe uses is going to really largely depend on really two things. Whether the biological parents have consented to the adoption, that's going to be the first consideration. And the second consideration is going to be whether the adoption will be decided by your tribal council or if it's going to be decided by your tribal court. And that last consideration is really important in determining which pathway we're going to take, primarily because when we think about adoptions who are going to be handled by your tribal court, that's going to be referred to as a tribal court adoptions. And that's going to go through your own tribal justice system, whether that be your court system, whether that be maybe an elders panel, if you're using an elders panel as your court, or any other type of justice systems. But adoptions that go through your tribal court are tribal court adoptions. What we're talking about today mainly is cultural adoptions, and those are tribal adoptions that go through your tribal council. And we see that a lot in those smaller communities that don't have the human capacity to have perhaps a separate tribal court and tribal council, or who haven't yet established their tribal courts. But the cultural adoptions, the purpose for today's webinar, excuse me, those are going to go be handled and decided and heard by your tribal council. And so this chart was taken from alaskatribes.org, which is a great website. If you have any questions, it's managed by Alaska Legal Services Corporations, and it's done by their Indian law attorneys who have a wealth of knowledge. But I wanted to include it here because it really does a great job of comparing cultural versus tribal court adoption. So on the left-hand side, you see the cultural adoption. On the right-hand side, you see the tribal court adoption. And so the first difference is what we just talked about. In a cultural adoption, the adoption is considered by the tribal council, whereas the tribal court adoption, the adoption is considered by the tribal court or the tribal council if the council is acting as their court. That's the first main difference. In a cultural adoption, the parents on the birth certificate must sign a consent to adoption unless some type of exception applies, such as the parent is deceased, or they had notice of the adoption and chose not to attend the hearing, or they could not be contacted. But in a cultural adoption, the parent's consent is required. In a tribal court adoption, we do not need the parent's consent. the tribal court can order an adoption despite a parent's objection, as long as the court is protecting due process. When we talk about the cultural adoption, the adoption is approved by tribal resolution, whereas the tribal court is approved through tribal order. And when we think about the original documents in a cultural adoption, the state of Alaska is going to retain all the original documents, whereas a tribal court adoption, the tribe is going to handle and could be the custodian of all those original documents. So again, the main difference between the two types of adoption procedures in tribes in Alaska is really going to be, do we have the parents' consent to adoption? And if we do, who is going to be handling it? Is it going to be heard by the tribal council or the tribal court? And so that's going to really be the two differences. But when we think about cultural adoptions and we think about tribal court adoptions in Alaska, it's important to note that because of the Indian Child Welfare Act, that all tribal court adoptions are entitled to full faith and credit under ICWA. When we're talking about cultural adoptions, and tribal court adoptions even. I mentioned before that we're not talking about the state of Alaska court system, and that's really important because a lot of our tribal citizens, a lot of the tribes we provide training and technical assistance to, they think that once a tribal court adoption is completed, that it has to be forwarded to the court system for some type of recognition, and it does not. In Alaska, tribal court adoption orders are handled directly by the Health Analytics and Vital Records, which was formerly known as the Bureau of Vital Statistics, or BVS. But they're the agency that's tasked within the Alaska state government for reviewing tribal court adoptions and issuing new birth certificates. So when we think and talk about tribal adoptions in tribal court or in our tribal councils, they do not need to be registered with the state court system. The state court system has nothing to do with issuing a birth certificate after any type of tribal adoption. So talking more about tribal cultural adoptions, again, we've kind of talked about this. The adoptions are considered by a tribal councils, by a tribe's council. And it's a council decision and a resolution. And procedurally, or how it works, is that cultural adoptions are going to be heard by your tribal council, and they're going to be approved by tribal resolution. And even though we are going through a tribal council process and not a formal tribal court process, it's important that your tribal council still follow and protect due process rights of everyone being involved. And so what that means is that all parties that have an interest in this particular adoption must be provided notice of the tribal council meeting where the adoption will be discussed and decided. And so when we think about who should be included in that notice, at a minimum, the parties to a cultural adoption would include the biological parents and the adopted parents. And again, that is really important because protecting due process rights is necessary in order to make sure that our tribal court orders and our tribal council resolutions withstand any challenges. And if we don't provide due process to parties, that is really the one avenue that any tribal court or tribal council resolution order, that's the one avenue that order can be challenged and can be turned around essentially. As we mentioned before, in a cultural adoption, the biological parents must sign a consent form to adopt, unless there's some type of exception, such as the biological parent's deceased, couldn't be contacted, or was provided notice and didn't show up. So that leads to be said that if we have an adoption that we're considering where the parents are not consenting, one parent does not consent, then that automatically takes that adoption out of cultural adoption. So if we have parents who are not consenting to the tribal adoption, we cannot use the cultural adoption process. We have to utilize your tribal courts or your tribal justice system as the process. In a cultural adoption, though, the adoptions are completed by tribal resolution. And then the state of Alaska, again, the Health Analytics and Vital Records provides a great cultural adoption package that is easily to be filled out and is sent down to Juneau to process and for the tribe to receive an original substitute birth certificate. And then finally, again, under cultural adoptions, the state of Alaska is going to keep all the original adoption documents, whereas in a tribal court adoption, those will remain at the tribe.
Can you the process something be cut off while you're talking about it?
Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that because you're breaking up just a bit, Nicoletta.
Are you able to explain this one about the due process when you were talking about the due process? It
Oh.
was cutting off a bit.
Yes, of course. Great question, Nicoletta. And you must have read my mind because that was the next slide we were going to talk about. But and I wanted to make sure that I included this, and Denise knows I generally include due process in every presentation because it is, again, it's one of those things that tribal courts need to protect, and it's fairly easy to do, but it is also one of those things where if we're not doing it, that our tribal court orders, that our tribal resolutions can be challenged and overturned. And so due process really focuses on protecting people's rights to know about a certain court procedure, a court hearing, or in this instance, a tribal council adoption, a cultural adoption. And so the three basic requirements of due process is that your tribal courts or tribal council, if they're acting as a court, provide notice. And you're going to provide notice to the parties that some type of court hearing or council hearing is taking place, and what it's about. You're going to provide opportunity to be heard, and that you have fair and impartial decision makers and hearings held in regular fashion. It sounds like a lot of words, and it sounds maybe a little bit challenging, but the easiest way of doing this is by making sure that when we're having, in this instance, a cultural adoption, that we're thinking about what rights are going to be involved. So if we are going to have this tribal child adopted to another family, what current relationships with that tribal child will be affected, and we want to make sure that we're inviting all of those people to come and participate in the cultural adoption process. And the notice can be provided through a notice of hearing, and that notice of hearing is going to tell you the date, the time, the location, and the subject of what the meeting is about. So in this case, it would be the cultural adoption. And that opportunity to be heard, you just need to be able to provide someone with the space and the opportunity to speak about what is happening. And that takes care of that particular due process requirement. If they come to the hearing and they choose not to speak, or if they get a copy of your notice of hearing and they choose not to attend, that is okay. That is their choice to make. We can't force people to talk in our council meetings or in our tribal court hearings, but we're required to give them just that space, just that opportunity to be heard. And then the third point, the fair and impartial decision makers, that really speaks to if there is an existing conflict of interest with either your tribal council members or your tribal judges. And so, for instance, if I were on tribal council and let's say that my niece was going to be try to be adopted to another family, because I have a close personal relationship with my niece, it may be improper for me to hear that case. And so I may want to step down from that case and have someone else take my place. But that's going to be another important requirement of due process. And you want to look at your existing tribal codes, your existing tribal laws, to see if your tribe has defined what a conflict of interest is. And if it hasn't, that may be a point that we want to start to increase what your tribal laws look like, because it's always helpful to have that in writing so that your judges, your council members know what the expectations are and know when they need to recuse themselves or know when they need to step down. Nicoletta, did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And so when we're talking about cultural adoptions, and again, this is going through our tribal council, some best practices recommendations are that the council should, and again, it's going to be the council's responsibility because they're the ones that are holding this hearing, they're the ones that are holding the meeting, they're going to be the ones that are making a decision on behalf of this tribal child. So you want to make sure that the council is confirming that all the parties that were entitled to receive notice actually receive notice. And the easiest way of doing this is making sure that when you send out your notice of hearings, that we're sending it either certified mail, we're sending it with a person who's going to file something with the court saying, yes, I personally handed this piece of paper to so-and-so. But we want to make sure that the council is confirming that everyone who was entitled to receive notice actually received notice. When the council meeting is going on, where we're discussing the adoption of the tribal child, you want to make sure also that in that particular setting, the council is acting like a court. So we want to think about whether or not we should be recording the hearings, or if we're having somebody taking notes. But the second bullet point here is we want to make sure that the council is specifying on the record which parties are absent and how they receive notice if the hearing proceeds without them. So this is where we're talking about, let's say Mom A was supposed to, she received notice, but she didn't appear at the tribal council hearing that was talking about the adoption of her child. So if Mom A isn't there, then the tribal president or the chief may say, you know, Mom A received notice on this date, but we're noticing that she's not here, but we're going to proceed without her. And that's just important to make sure that not only our written records match what is happening, but that we're putting it on the record of the tribal council hearing in case we need to go back and review those notes. The third point is that you want to confirm that your council has jurisdiction to hear the case. And this is when we're talking about the tribal child either being a member or a citizen of your tribe or eligible for membership or citizenship. And so you just want to confirm that on the record. And I have a little note here that if the child is in state custody, meaning if OCS has custody of the child, then OCS must consent to the adoption taking place in tribal courts. And there's a separate process for that. It essentially requires reaching out to OCS, letting them know that there's a potential adoption, and getting their consent to the adoption taking place in tribal courts. And the final due process best practice here is that I always want to fall back on that your tribe may have written or customary tribal court laws or codes that govern adoptions proceedings. And it's important that if you do have existing laws, if you do have existing procedures or existing codes, we want to make sure that those codes are followed exactly as they're written. Again, because that is another avenue, that's another reason that tribal court orders or tribal council resolutions can be overturned if they're not following your accepted and your past processes and your laws and procedures. So if we have those laws and those procedures, we want to make sure that we're following them. So talking a little bit more about notice and who should receive notice. Remember, we just said that we want anybody who has a relationship with the child currently that is up for adoption, we want to make sure that they receive notice. And so this is going to include, of course, the adoptive parents. It's going to include any parents whose rights have not been terminated, including any possible fathers, anyone who's taking care of the child, anyone with visitation rights for the child that could be affected by the adoption. The child, we don't want to have the adopted child at the adoption hearing, but if they are of an age that is appropriate, I think the state of Alaska allows for, I think, 11, 12, maybe 13-year-olds to have a say in the adoption, then we may consider having the child there to have an input from them directly on what their feelings are regarding the possible adoption. But that is going to be an evaluation. It's going to be a decision that's going to be made by your tribal council on how young is too young to have them there. But other parties would be maybe an ICWA or a family services worker, if there are any involved in the tribal childs, if they have any involvement with the current adoption and any actions with the child. And then also a child's advocate. If there was like a court-appointed advocate or guardian ad litem, we want to make sure that they're included and that they receive notice of the tribal council hearing and discussion where this potential adoption, this cultural adoption is going to take place. And so what findings are important, right? So we've noticed the hearing in front of the tribal council. We've sent notice to all the parties. All the parties have received that notice. And now this is the day of considering the tribal adoption. So we're talking about the adoption with the council. What key findings are important? Again, my best recommendation is that we want to make sure we're looking to your existing tribal code. We're looking to your existing tribal law to see if there are any specific findings that your particular tribe requires when you're considering any type of adoptions. If there are, we want to make sure that when we're discussing the adoptions in that tribal council meeting, and if your tribal council is making these findings, that we're going through and that we're addressing each of those required findings that's found in your code or your law. But additional findings that we want to maybe consider is due process findings, right? And we've talked about that, making sure that if someone is absent, and we're going to continue, that we say on the record and maybe in our tribal resolution that so-and-so received notice on this date, but was not present at the hearing, but we're moving forward. We also want to remember when we're talking about cultural adoptions, the parental consent of the biological parents is required. And so if they have consented, then we want to make sure that we're putting those findings in our tribal resolution. Parent A is present and is the biological parent of tribal child, insert name, and has consented to the adoption. Also, again, all parties who must consent to the adoption have consented, and we just talked about that. Those are going to be the biological parents. We want to make a finding of the child if they're old enough, and if they consent to the adoption, we want to make sure we're putting that on the record and we're including that in our tribal resolution. If there's a state child welfare agency, like what we just talked about, if the child is currently in OCS custody, and the state child welfare agency has consented to the tribal court adoption, we want to make sure that's included in our tribal resolution as well. And then we want to make some best interest findings, right? And most of the tribal laws that I've seen in the YK region have this broad umbrella when we're talking about children, that that things need to be in the best interest of the child. And it's a similar requirement in the states. And so you'll see that the second bullet point is that the adoption is in the child's best interest. Alongside with that is that the adoptive parents are able to provide for the child's physical, mental, emotional, and financial needs. If the child's already been placed in the adoptive home, just make a finding, inquire with the adoptive parents, inquire with the child if the child is old enough, or with your social services department if they're monitoring that, that the child is doing well in the home, and put that in your resolution. If a home study is required by your tribal laws, making sure that the home study was completed and that the results were favorable. And then finally, we want to talk about what is going to be the child's name following the adoption. Will the child's last name change to match the adoptive family's last name? Are we going to keep the original biological last name, or is the name going to completely change? But we want to make sure that that is discussed and that finding is contained in your tribal resolution. And then the effect of the adoption on child's tribal membership status. I was a little hesitant to put this because I haven't seen any tribal codes in Alaska that if a child is adopted, that they lose membership or citizenship status. But I wanted to make sure that I put that there because it may be a consideration. And again, you want to look at your existing tribal laws and your tribal codes to see if there's any effect that adoption has on a child's membership or citizenship status. Some additional findings to consider. And these are in addition to what we just talked about, but just a discussion about whether the child's biological parents, if they're going to retain any traditional responsibilities, any ceremonial responsibilities toward the child, whether the child's going to have any right of inheritance from their biological parents. And we want to think about and talk about visitation or contact, whether visitation or contact is going to be allowed between the child and their biological parents. Or if visitation or contact will be allowed between the child and their biological relatives, if they're adopted by non-relatives in the traditional sense of the word. So those are some just additional findings to consider. And it seems like a lot, but when we go through each, it's really easy to put this into your tribal resolution. And again, if we're not including the tribal resolution, the last 3 slides really give you some information on kind of what we want to discuss when we're considering a cultural adoption through the tribal council, and some of those issues that may come up that we want to make sure that we're discussing in that setting and making a decision on. And so I want to pause because we've gone through quite a bit so far, and I want to see if there's any questions before we move on to the forms. Okay. Excuse me. So let's talk about the cultural adoption forms. And so these next forms, this is an actual cultural adoption package. And again, cultural adoption is going through your tribal council, where you have the consent of the biological parents or some exception applies. But these are provided by the state of Alaska Health Analytics and Vital Records, formerly called the Bureau of Vital Statistics. And they can be located there. And I think that Denise and her team sent them out to you as well. And so the forms are included are requests for a new birth certificate following cultural adoption. And that's going to be that substitute birth certificate that we talked about earlier. It includes a sample tribal resolution that tribes can utilize and just fill in and sign, a tribal statement, a parental statement, and then it includes 2 pages where they're seeking information regarding the biological parents. And so the pack is available as a PDF. It's really, it's pretty self-explanatory to fill out. But I would recommend that if we're doing a cultural adoption, that we use the state of Alaska forms. And the reason why I say that is because the state folks in Juneau are used to seeing their forms, and it contains all the information that they are looking for. That's not to say that you can't use your own tribal resolution, you can't use your own tribal statement form, but if we do choose to use our own forms or our own documents, we want to make sure that all of the information that the state is requiring on their forms is reflected in our forms or our documents that we're sending in. But again, the easiest way would be to use the state of Alaska forms. And I think I saw a hand up. Was there a question?
So before we get to that, there was one question in the chat that says, what if the parent dies and the other parent is in jail? Does the adoptive parent need to have consent from the other parent who is in jail?
So not from the parent who passed away. That is one of those exceptions. As far as a parent who is in jail, my recommendation would be to try to contact that parent in jail to see if they would consent to the adoption. As far as I understand, being incarcerated is not one of those exceptions that will allow for a cultural adoption to go forward. So in that instance, if the parent is in jail and is objecting to the cultural adoption, then the adoption would have to go through your tribal court where the tribal court can then terminate the parental rights.
Are you
Thanks,
able to hear me?
Yep,
Hey,
Virginia,
Virginia.
I was going to go to you next.
Oh. And then my question, you just went through that. I was going to ask who consents the adoption. And the biological parents have no rights to the child. Is it that resolution or is it the council who consents that adoption?
Yeah, and that's a good question, Virginia. If the parents will consent to the adoption, then it can go through your tribal council. If one or both of the parents object to the adoption, then it has to go through your tribal court.
I'm asking if the parents lost custody of the children.
Yeah, if the parental rights have already been terminated prior to the adoption process starting, then those parents do not have to consent. So if let's say that we had mom whose parental rights were terminated either by state court or tribal court for some reason, and the child is only with dad, if dad consents to the adoption, we don't have to have mom because her rights were already terminated. Did that answer your question, Virginia?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to go through these forms. And these forms can be a little tricky. I want to start off by saying that. And so I tried to highlight some of the pitfalls and what to look out for when we're filling out these forms. But again, my recommendation is to use the provided state of Alaska forms because the folks that are down in Juneau who are going to be processing these are most familiar with these forms. But if we don't, then we want to make sure that for like the resolution or the tribal statement, that we're making sure that we're including the information that they need. But this is the form, this is the request for a substitute, which is a new birth certificate after adoption. And so what the health analytics and vital records is going to be doing is they're going to be using this form, the information on this form, to find the child's pre-adoption birth certificate and use this information on this form to create the child's birth certificate after adoption. And so this form itself, this request for a substitute birth certificate, it's required to be filled out and certified and signed by a tribal official. So somebody from your tribe who's authorized to fill that out. And so when we're talking about cultural adoptions, because they're going through our tribal council, that's going to be either your tribal council president or chief, your vice president or chairman. It could be your tribal administrator. It could be your secretary. But it needs to be filled out by your tribal council or somebody authorized from your tribal government. And it should not be filled out by either the adopted parents or anyone else. And the reason why is because there is a certification you're required to sign saying that you're a tribal official. And there's also a $60 processing fee, which is going to include a certified copy of that new birth certificate that's going to be sent back to the tribe and not to the adopted parents. So again, this form is required to be filled out by someone from your tribal government who is authorized to fill it out. And that's going to be important because that same person is going to be required to sign all of the different forms. And the agency in Juneau recommends that the same person signs each form. And what I mean by that is if we have the tribal president signing this substitute birth certificate request form, then we want to have the tribal president sign the tribal resolution and all the other documents. I think it gets a little confusing for state folks when we have different people signing. I don't understand why, but that would be my recommendation, to make it as easy for them as possible. The second is what we talked about before, which is a tribal resolution. And this resolution is to let the agency know that your council met, you discussed the adoption, and you approved the adoption, and that the adopted parents are now requesting a substitute birth certificate. And again, this is an easy form. You can fill it out online or by pen in blue or black ink, but you are allowed to use your own tribal resolution. But again, we want to make sure that if we're using our own tribal resolution, that we're making sure that the information that the state is requesting on their tribal resolution is contained in yours. This document is also required to be certified. And so, as I mentioned before, that if we have the tribal chief or the president or the tribal administrator signing the first document, you want to make sure they're signing this document again. And then so it also requires a signature of your tribal government official or someone who's authorized to act on behalf of the tribal council. Sometimes we have tribal resolutions that are signed by the secretary, and that's okay if your tribe allows for your secretary to sign that. But again, we want to make sure the person that is signing the tribal resolution is also the person that's signing the request for his substitute birth certificate. Okay, and I didn't update this picture and I apologize, but there is another one called a tribal statement form. And this is a document that's used to inform the agency that the tribal child is a member of the tribe or is the biological child of a tribal citizen. So that goes back to that either is a member or is eligible for memberships. And so some of the findings that we talked about, those important findings to consider, are going to be included on this document that's provided by the state. And that is the jurisdiction of your tribal council to hear and decide adoption matters involving this particular tribal child. And that jurisdictional statement, that yes, we have jurisdiction because the tribal child is an enrolled citizen of our tribe. And then you're going to also have some information on the tribal statement that talks about, it's going to ask about biological parents. It's going to ask about the biological parents' names. It's going to ask about the adopted parents' names. And it's going to ask for information relating to whether or not the biological parents did or did not sign the parental statement, which is what we're going to talk about next, which is essentially is a written consent to a cultural adoption. And so this, yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but before you move further, this is Agnes at the Illuminate Tribe. Good to see you.
Hi, Agnes.
You mentioned on the certification portion of the, can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay. If you go back one, the tribal certification form, you mentioned it must be signed by the tribal government official. I got distracted. Did you mean like the president or secretary if they're approved to do so?
Yes, that's exactly right.
And or the tribal administrator?
Yes. Yep. Exactly right. So if, and it would be whoever normally signs and certifies their tribal resolution. So, most tribes have that resolutions are signed by their tribal president and they're certified by like the secretary or the treasurer. But if that process is different in your particular tribe, whomever is authorized on behalf of your tribal government to sign tribal resolutions can sign this one.
That usually be our president or the administrator that I'm familiar with. But I could ask. Thank you.
You're welcome. Good question. So the tribal statement form, again, that is really so that the health analytics and vital records can really just get some information about the bio parents, the adoptive parents, and again, part of the process of the steps needed for that cultural adoption, such as whether the biological parents did or did not sign the parental statement and consent. So that leads us to the parental statement. And this document is, again, it's required to be signed by both biological parents of the tribal child if they are named on the birth certificate. And it's used to certify that the biological parents are the parents of the tribal child. And so this is, let me just see something here. And so this parental statement, it is not giving consent to the adoption. This is essentially saying that the tribal child is a member of such and such tribe, and then the bio mother and the bio father are certifying under penalty of perjury that, yes, that is true. But this is a required form. Unfortunately, this form is required to be notarized by the biological parents when they are signing. And again, I want to emphasize that if on the original birth certificate, we just have mom or we have mom and dad, that whomever is on the original birth certificate will be required to sign this parental statement and to have it notarized. And I know that in certain villages, we don't have a notary available. I mean, oftentimes, if there's a state court, the clerk of court's authorized to be a notary, or oftentimes the postmaster at our post office is a notary as well. But if there is no notary available in your village or in your tribe, reach out to me. I'm not certain whether or not a self-certification will be accepted by the state. But if you don't have a notary, please reach out to me or to Denise, and we can jump on a call down to Juneau to find out what they recommend to get done, because that is a challenge.
Rick, one more question. You mentioned about the hold on. Whichever parent is on the birth certificate must sign this parental statement. Is it the original or the substitute birth certificate?
It would be, Agnes, another good question. It would be the original birth certificate if there's been no adoption before.
Okay, thank you.
Let's say that, yeah, you're welcome, of course. But let's say the child has been adopted once already and they're being adopted again, then it would be the adopted birth certificate. But if there's been no prior adoption, it's going to be the original one.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. And the last form that's included in the state's package is just some information about the biological parent. And this isn't required to be signed. It's not required to be notarized. This can be filled out by either the bio parents if they fill it out. It can be filled out by your social services department if they know this information. But this information is really, it's going to be held in the state files in Juneau. And it's going to ask for some information such as the age, the race, the origin of the bio parents, any medical histories, blood types, medical information about blood relatives. It'll have like physical descriptions of the biological parents, religious preferences of the biological parents. And this is really to gain some information about the biological parents after or before an adoption happens, to keep in the state files. And this information can be shared with the adopted child once they reach the age of 18 if they request it. Excuse me. So this may be helpful if, for instance, we have an adoption where the biological parents are not going to remain in the adopted child's life, and somehow they get disconnected and years pass, and the child, it ends up being 19, 20, 21, and they're wondering about my relatives. They're wondering about what kind of medical issues or history my original biological parents had. They can reach out to the state of Alaska, who will provide them this information that will have that type of information that will help that adopted child move forward. So again, this document does not need to be filled out by the biological parents, although it can be, but we want to make sure that we're filling this out by someone who has an understanding of the history of the biological parents, in case the adopted child wants to have this information later on in life. Okay, so the final section of today is going to be talking about best practices and recommendations. And I think that we've probably already incorporated a lot of this into our training today, so it's going to be really just a review. The first one is that the adoption documents and that package that we just went over from the state, those are legal documents. And so the state of Alaska, again, they're going to retain those original documents in a cultural adoption setting. And so it's important that we are making sure that we're filling those out correctly, and that we're using either blue or black ink, or or a typewriter. I'm laughing because when I was reviewing the information for today, the state of Alaska said, we recommend using a typewriter. I don't know anybody who still has a typewriter. If you have one, I mean, feel free to use that. But if you don't, we want to make sure that we're using blue or black ink to prepare the document and for the signatures. Again, because the state is going to retain the original documents, that means that all of documents that are sent down to Juneau must be the original signed documents. So they won't accept any copies, they won't accept any faxes, and that's because the state of Alaska, the laws require the original documents to issue any substitute birth certificates. So alongside with that, the agency down in Juneau, they're very particular. So if any of your forms have any erasures, meaning that we're trying to erase it, any whiteouts, any we're crossing things out, they will not accept those forms. They'll send it back to you, rejecting it, and we'll have to go through the process of filling them out again. So the recommendation is to take some time when you're filling these forms out, making sure that we're putting in the correct information and making sure that there's no erasing, there's no whiteouts, and we're not crossing anything out. And then finally, with signatures, they can't be photographed, they can't be stamped, they can't be typewritten. So we want to make sure that the original signatures in blue or black ink are contained on all of the documents in the cultural adoption package. This is helpful. So if your tribe is considering a cultural adoption, excuse me, and if you need an original copy of a child's birth certificate, and again, that's going to be used to fill in those forms and to utilize in completing for that request for substitute birth certificate after adoption, there's a process where the tribal government can send a letter on tribal letterhead requesting a copy of a birth certificate for adoption purposes only. And so on the screen there, you'll see there's a birth certificate request form that's going to be included alongside with a $30 check or money order and a copy of the ID of the tribal member requesting the birth certificate. So whomever is signing that tribal letter, whomever is signing that birth certificate request form, will also need to include a copy of that. And what the state of Alaska will do, they'll send a copy of the birth certificate, and you can use that to help fill out the cultural adoption forms after a cultural adoption. And that'll be the easiest way of getting that. Of course, if you have a copy of the child's birth certificate available, you don't need this process. But if for some reason we don't have a copy of that, this is going to be the process that we go through to request a copy of the original birth certificate from the state of Alaska. And this is on the request for a new birth certificate following cultural adoption. So the substitute birth certificate form. And we talked about this. If the child is currently in state custody, meaning that it's under the jurisdiction or in the custody of OCS, you will need to get a release from OCS before. And so there's a box on the top form that says yes. But again, we talked about that if the child is in OCS custody, that we want to make sure that we're reaching out to our OCS worker prior to the tribal council holding a hearing to make sure that we receive their approval to use tribal court for the adoption, for lack of a better term. So some more best practices and recommendations. And I included these because I've seen, I've worked with tribes before that have gone through this process, haven't followed these recommendations, and their package is rejected by Juneau and sent back to the tribe. So we want to make sure that the child's name at birth. And so that's going to be found on the original birth certificate. So again, either we have a copy of it or we can request a copy of it. But the first, the middle, two names if there are, and the last name, it has to be the same on all pages, all forms in that cultural adoption package. So for instance, is Richard Garcia on my birth certificate. So I need to make sure I put Richard Garcia on all forms. If I change one form and I put Rick Garcia, because that's what I'm used to people calling me, then Juneau is going to reject that. So we want to make sure we're including the full legal name of the child at birth on all the pages and forms. And that's going to include on the request for a new birth certificate. It's going to be on the tribal resolution. So if we are drafting our own tribal resolution, please make sure we're using our child's full legal name at birth. It's also going to be in the tribal statement and the parental statement. Similarly, or the same, the adopted name of the child must be the same on all pages in the adoption package. Again, any discrepancies will cause a delay in processing, and it also may be a reason for Juneau to reject the package and the request. And so the adopted name is going to go on the request for new birth certificate or the substitute birth certificate and the tribal resolution. And the same thing, I'm not going to go through both of these, but the biological parent's name must be the same on all forms, and the adopted parents' names must be the same on all forms. So the biggest takeaway from the past two slides are that all names must be exactly the same on all forms. And then finally, before sending the original documents and paperwork to Health and Vital Records down in Juneau, you want to make sure that we're making a copy for the tribe's records or a copy for the adopted parents' records. Again, the state of Alaska law that requires that for a substitute birth certificate to be issued, that the Juneau office retain original documents. So if you're sending them photocopies or for faxing documents in, it's going to be rejected because it's not complying with state law. So send the originals down, but before we send them down, make sure we make a copy. Of course, there's a $60 fee, which can be paid by check or money order. And we want to make sure that we're sending it to this particular address. There is a special services unit within Health Analytics and Vital Records whose sole job is to process cultural adoptions and do birth certificates. And they're located in Juneau. They're not located in Anchorage, and that is the address we want to send it to. And finally, some resources. I mentioned that the Juneau office is the office that really processes all of these. And you'll see there it is a special services unit. So if we're calling either the Anchorage office to talk to them and be transferred to Juneau, or if we're calling the main number on the screen for Juneau, and we have questions about birth certificates or cultural adoptions process, you want to make sure that you're asking for the special services unit. We don't want to get caught up in all of the customer service reps that are going to answer the phone beforehand because they're not going to know what you're talking about. You want to talk to the special services unit. If you're here in Anchorage, they have an office inside the DMV office here on Old Seward next to Joanne Fabrics. Again, they're not going to handle the cultural adoptions and the birth certificates, but they may be able to answer some questions. But our main office is going to be the Special Services Unit in Juneau. And just to know, they're open Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, but they're not available by phone on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And on the screen there is the phone number, the fax number. Again, we want to make sure we're talking to somebody from the Special Services Unit.
Rick, this is Agnes again from Russian Mission.
Hey, Agnes.
Hi, can you please email us this, what you just, your presentation?
Yeah, of course, Agnes. I will ask for Denise's team to email again to you. Yeah, we'll make sure we get that out for you.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. So I wanted to pause and see if there's any questions. I know that was a ton of information, and it seems like a more confusing process than it is, but it really isn't. We just want to make sure that we're following. And again, I would recommend using the State of Alaska forms because they're already ready for all of us to use. But does anyone have any questions about what we covered today?
And I do want to remind everybody that if you're calling in by phone, you have to press *6 to unmute yourself. If you're calling or if you're dialing in via the app, there's the microphone button at the top right-hand side of your screen that you click to unmute yourself.
Okay, if there are no questions, then I do want to add a little plug-in for the Resource Center. The Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, we've been working on a book. It's titled Alaska Native Women Ending the Violence, Reclaiming a Sacred Status. And the Resource Center has been working on this book for a number of years, and we're super excited that it's going to be released soon. We're anticipating it's going to be ready to be printed and released by June of this year. And what we're really excited about, it's the first time that we know of that a book about Alaska has been written about by Alaska Native women. And so some of the co-authors and authors include Tammy Charit-Giroux, our executive director, Michelle Demert of UAF now, Deborah O'Gara of UAF, and Jack Zagudik, who is a huge Alaska advocate and been working with Resource Center for years. And so we're really excited about it. It focuses on violence in Alaska. And again, it's Alaska specific and Alaska based. But when we're thinking about tribal courts and justice systems and all of the work that each of you on the call do, it's a really great read because it compiles all of the history of Alaska, federal laws that affect Alaska, all into one short 200-page book. So when it's released, I hope that everybody goes out and purchases it. And I'm sure that we're going to have some type of book release party or some kind of distribution going on. But just kind of wanted to mention that keep an eye out. It's going to be coming soon, and we're very excited for it. And then finally, if anybody ever has any questions, and if we can ever help in any way, please don't hesitate to reach out. Again, I'm always so thankful to Denise and Roxanne and both of their teams for continuing to invite me over to AVCP to talk with everyone. The AVCP tribes and the people in the Bethel region were so welcoming when I first came to Alaska, and really kind of like helped me find my passion in the work that I do. And so I'm always so grateful and thankful to come back and help out.
Thank you, Rick. It looks like Nicoletta is writing maybe a question in the chat, but I also wanted to ask one more time if anybody has any questions.
This is for you, Denise. I'm just wanting a copy of the visuals. I don't have any visuals on by phone for now.
Okay, all of the information should have been sent to the email address that you registered with, but we'll definitely get that to you.
Okay, and I don't have email. I only have a fax machine.
Okay. What is your phone number? I'm gonna have one of our staff reach out to you.
Nicoletta knows my number and my fax number.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you. I'll get that information to you.
Awesome, thank you. Sorry about that, Rick.
Oh, no problem. And I'm looking through the chat, and I'm sorry, I didn't realize you guys could see all my multiple screens, but I'm looking at Nicoletta, your question. Does it also apply to fathers who aren't on their birth certificate, but is considered the bio father due to child support? Yes, it would. And the reason why I say yes is because if child support was ordered, then a court must have made some determination that that father was either legally responsible or the biological father of a child that may not have been on the original birth certificate. So that's a great point, Nicoletta, that we want to make sure that we include anyone in this process that we know have a relationship, which would also include someone who's paying child support.
I keep saying one more question or one more go around, but I'm gonna ask one more time if anybody has any questions, because I know, it's a little bit hard to be able to unmute yourself when we're on the phone or on the computer. So if there are any questions, last call.
For you, Denise Nerby.
Mhm.
This is Agnes at Russian Mission.
Hi, Agnes.
Remember our Ilocos Traditional Council was supposed to get a tribal court assessment,
Yes, ma'am.
and then the pandemic hit, so we're still waiting for word on that, an update from AVCP.
Okay. Let me.
You said your name is Agnes? This is Nicoletta.
I will circle back with you, Nicoletta, when I'm back in the office tomorrow, so that we could get that checked out for Agnes in the Gothmute tribe.
Okay.
Thank you, Rick and ladies.
No problem. So if there are no more questions for Rick, thank you so much, Rick, for being our presenter today. We always appreciate all of the information that you give to us. It's always very relevant and on point. So thank you. We really appreciate you always being here for us. Another thing that I wanted to let everybody know about is that we have a number of virtual training sessions coming up this year. Our information is out on Facebook, but I will also work with my staff on dispersing that information via email. And we will also get that to you out there with the facts that we send you with the presentation material too. So we will be sending that information out. We also have in-person events. They're kind of taking turns with tribal services. So some of them are tribal government related and some of them are tribal court related. The next one for tribal justice that is coming up is the domestic violence training we have with the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. That's going to be here in Bethel on June 13, 14, and 15. Registration for the event is out, though at this point travel scholarships are passed. And then in July we have a code development training that is going to be here in Bethel as well. Registration is open for that event and we're welcoming everybody for travel scholarships. So if you haven't registered for that, please do so, because we want to get you to training here in Bethel. Another one, I know I'm going a little bit into the future, but in August, we're having an ICWA tribal child welfare training that's titled For the Children, and that information is coming out soon. So I feel like I talked really fast. So I'm gonna stop there. And I welcome anybody to call AVCP for any information. If you need to get a hold of Rick, we're happy to pass on any messages or connect you with Rick in any way. Beyond that, thank you everybody for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, Rick.